to reaching the Eastern Church Fathers. When I started reading the Eastern Church Fathers, I found that so much of what they considered problematic, or what I considered problematic, I should say, in this sort of Latin Augustinian Western Christianity, and I had rejected and overtly opposed, I found, first of all, not only did they not have those doctrines, they did not have the doctrine of original sin the way Augustine did. They didn't have the nature of grace divine the way Augustine did. They did not have an arbitrary deity the way Augustine did. And I say Augustine, but I mean, it flowers, of course, into the scholastics and beyond, into Reformation, post-Reformation, scholastic theology, Catholic and Protestant. Not only did they not have those doctrines, when they did speak on those topics, I saw a very different sort of theology that was there, a very different way of looking. So I saw, for example, that in their anthropology, I thought it was fascinating that when they looked at the doctrine that man is an image of God, right, from Genesis, that we're an icon of God, that you really had this robust theology of image, right? So Plato talks about two different types of image, one that is sort of non-substantial, like shadows, right? But then these other types of images, like reflections, have some sort of, substantial connection. They're a substantial thing. And Plato, of course, is always interested in definitions and essential properties, right? Square is four-sided, whatever it may be. When he's looking at the definition of what is an image, something that really intrigues him is the fact that images are essentially referential, right? It is an image of, and you need to fill in the blank and refer to something that's not it, namely its archetype. And I see this, this comes through in some of the ancient talk of idolatry as well as images in the Old Testament, but the Church Fathers really see it as significant to anthropology, because if what we are is images of God, they presume that essential to us as human beings is that we have a connection with our archetype, which is God. And so the stark contrast between nature grace is actually that there is an essential, unbreakable connection between me and God. And it's that connection that actually makes me susceptible to participating in God. And so the fall, rather than being sort of this loss of some, arbitrary gift that God may or may not give, really had to do with just a distortion or a covering or a tarnishing of something that's there. And redemption had to do with sort of untwisting that or unburying it, because essential to human nature was this sort of root connection with God that could never be broken or destroyed. Which was such a stark contrast with the nature-grace divide. When talking about God, the idea that God essentially wills the good of creatures, such that people like Athanasius suggest it would be unworthy of God, right? It's out of step with God's character if humanity falls, demonic schemes take over, and he doesn't redeem us, right? Like, that's inconceivable. And in fact, it's interesting when you look at certain things like the Philokalia of Origen, which is edited by, Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nazianzus. So it's sort of a proved text of Origen. The ways in which, when they look at this, it's really sort of certain readings of scripture, such as Romans 9, where God maybe sort of just chooses Moses to bless and Pharaoh to destroy, which is a sort of common Western trend, at least in certain theological circles. They dismiss that as obviously false. Like, it's not even a possible reading worth entertaining because it's so out of step with how they see God. So far from an arbitrary character, there's this sort of insistence on the goodness of God that drives toward the providential care for and redemption of the creature. And that is this relentless pursuit that sort of always serves as a buttress against any sort of arbitrary dealings with humanity of the kind that you would see in the Augustinian theology. And then with that, you see this intersection between nature and man, where it's not just the idea that we are made to participate in God, that God is some way meant to be eminent within us as icons of God, but that's also meant to go from us to the rest of the cosmos. So far from this sort of lowly picture of nature as some sort of thing that, is on this lower level of a nature-grace divide, nature has, again, this sort of destiny of participating in God, becoming a conduit or vehicle for God. And the tether to that, which is, the icons of God, man, for example, have this unseverable, connection with it. And then even in terms of redemption, what you see is that redemption is really seen as the creator God himself entering the creation in order to redeem it and restore it from within, because God is so relentless in that pursuit of the creature. So when I started to see that picture, the contrast was so stark between the systems of Western scholasticism, which then persisted in various forms in modern philosophy, people like Leibniz, and what I saw in the Eastern Fathers. And that shift that took place was so monumental. What I really saw there was that all of the intuitions that I had from the God of the philosophers, and I was trying to construct, this something that was a cohesive way of holding together my moral intuitions, spiritual intuitions, and all the rest. I realized that I didn't need to construct it, right? It was already there in these fathers. And not only were they claiming that it was there, it wasn't just sort of a system of philosophy, according to them, right? It was the system of the cosmos, right? Because it was rooted in the very facts of the nature of the world itself and this event of the incarnation. So
that's, I think I totally, obviously I totally vibe with what you're saying in terms of the difference. I find it interesting that, because when you were talking about this hierarchy of loves, I actually just did a conference for a college here in Ontario about Dante and his hierarchy of loves. And I feel like there's still, like, even in the West, there was still some, because in Dante, you get a sense in which the world, you could see it in different ways. Like, you could see the world as this permeation of God's love that descends through different intermediaries all the way down into hell. Or you could see it the other way, which is levels of separation depending on how your loves are oriented. So it seems like there's still possibility within even at least the Western storytelling to find versions of something which is more like the notion of God's love, which actually fills up the world and is, like the idea that, like St. Ephraim's notion that the fire in hell is God's love, basically, that it's actually this fullness of reality. And so anyways, I just
struck me as critical in terms of the difference between East and West. And this has to do with the topics of divine simplicity and the essence energies distinction that you end up seeing there. So in the Latin West, one of the sort of critical moments that happens in Augustine's own thinking is this idea that God is a super simple essence, right, is the term that he ends up using. And this is largely due to the influence of Platonism. Now, I'm not doing the dirty trick where you say like, oh, it's Platonism, so it's bad. Actually, big fan, Plato, big fan. A lot of truth there, big fan. And I think there's a lot of resonance in, between Plato and the Eastern Church Fathers and things like that.
Yeah.
But Augustine probably had a little too much fondness for Plato. I believe the quote went something like, I am convinced I will find nothing in the writings of the Platonists that conflict with Holy Scripture. Probably a tad too optimistic right there. But nonetheless, this idea that, working within a certain understanding of Platonism, the framework Augustine ends up adopting is that really what you have is you have the forms, right? These archetypes that are the models for material instances, right? So you have the archetypal square of four-sidedness, equal length, and then you have instances of square. And the instances are always related to materiality, right? And that's where you get definite size and you get color, and you can also have imperfections and number and all that sort of stuff. And yet the forms transcend all of that. And so they transcend those sorts of accidental properties. But then for Augustine, God is, the good, or the form of the good that transcends even those other forms. And so there's a certain simplicity that emerges there that's even above that of the forms, because a square, for example, has four-sidedness, equal length. It's complex, right? Yeah. So it's essential, but it's not simple, right? And God is beyond even that. Well, that creates all sorts of challenges that basically set the tone for most of what the scholastics are going back and forth about. It sets all sorts of challenges for scholastic theology, precisely because when you start to ask these questions like, there's obvious ones like the Trinity. If you have super simple essence, how do you have several persons? But even issues like divine knowledge, right? If God doesn't have accidental properties, because accidental properties like color or size, these shifting properties are properties of matter, and God is above all that. And God can know that I'm, waving my hand right now. Isn't that a shifting property in God? Or if I make a free choice and my choice could be otherwise, doesn't mean that's a property in God that could be otherwise. And so how do you have God have knowledge of the world? Or how do you have God make free choices himself if free choices are choices that could have been otherwise? And all of these sorts of things that unfold in scholastic thought that become major problems for how to embrace this sort of form of, this form of theology, or, this Platonism, this simplicity doctrine, while still affirming the things of Christianity. And one of the things that you begin to see is one of the standard solutions in terms of how they deal with this is basically internal relations versus external relations. And so the Trinity is an internal relation, the super simple essence relating to itself as Father, and in this sense it produces a relation, also an identity, not only as Father but also as Son, and the love between those and things like that. So it tries to make the Trinity not an additional property or something like that, but a relational sort of phenomena out of sort of the essence self-relating. And then you have external relations where, God is the first cause, affects the material world in a certain way, and the effects are external relations of God that in some ways sort of solve this problem. And that's how they try to do it. Incidentally, personally, I think most of these solutions don't actually work in solving this problem, but nonetheless, they do their darndest to make sure that they try to make them work. But I think the big challenge that you see is because of the doctrine of simplicity, and that particular form of the doctrine of simplicity, God is never really eminent in creation in the way it would be in the Eastern Fathers. Yes. So grace, for example, officially according to the Catholic Church, right? It's created, right? It is created grace. And why is it created? Well, because it's an effect, right? When you're talking about the presence of God, he's present via the effect. So my order of loves shifts because of prevenient grace. And now I have an order of loves from which I can, if I freely cooperate, produce deeds that are meritorious before God. But that's not in any way a part of God in me, right? God is in me via the effect that has been wrought upon me. And that's why grace is ultimately created, because it's all creature over here. Whereas for the Eastern Fathers, yes, they talk about divine simplicity. But when you look at their talk of divine simplicity, there's all sorts of ways in which it's very different than that. So Gregory of Nyssa is very clear, contra Antinomians, that yes, the divine essence is simple, right? Whatever God is one thing. This sort of, the divine nature is simple. But he says, but the persons aren't, right? There's three of them. And then you see people like Basil of Caesarea saying, well, the essence is one, but the energies that exude from it, those are, how many? They're innumerable. Yeah. And so they start to draw these sorts of distinctions. And the reason this is critical is because when you look at I'm sure you know this about the essence energies, but rather than presuming that all your listeners do, the basic concept of this essence energies distinction is, the term energia emerges from Aristotle, right? And it initially emerges in the context of the unmoved mover and refers to a certain type of activity, right? So Aristotle being convinced that all this mutative, changing stuff in our world has to stand upon something that's unchanging, right? That doesn't mutate. He had to develop a term that refers to that type of perfect non-mutative activity that his God would do. And so he draws the distinction between kinesis, which is progressive, incomplete, changing motion, like building a house, goes through stages, and abandon it, versus complete or perfect activity, like seeing. Every time I look at you, it's complete in that moment. And then the Alexandrian Jews thought this was a really useful way of talking about God and his activity. And so they start to embrace this. But unlike Aristotle, who had said that God's essence is energia, right? He is just nothing but pure, perfect activity. The Alexandrian Jews drew a distinction between God's face and his back, drawing from the story of Moses, right? Show me your glory. And he says, I'll show you my face. I can't show you my face. I might see my face and live, but I'll show you my back. Which became interpreted, at least in people like Philo of Alexandria, like the distinction between God's essence, who he is in himself, and the energies, those aspects that exude from God and come down to us and convey who he is. And then that distinction plays its way out in a couple of different ways. In Alexandrian Judaism, there was also this notion of transference, where the operative powers that express a nature are in some ways communicable. So the favorite metaphor, or the favorite analogy for the church fathers, is always fire and metal, right? That you stick metal in fire and then it starts to glow and burn, and you remove it, and now it has the energies, right? Or the energy of fire in it, of heating and lighting. It's still metal, right? But something of the nature of fire has been communicated to it. And that became the way of explaining things like demoniacs. How our demoniacs have secret knowledge or superhuman strength or whatever it is. They're participating, they're energized by those things, right? They're participating in a foreign nature, the energies of that foreign nature. And it also became how they explain prophets, right? Energized by, God, or by the holy angels in Second Maccabees. It's the holy angels that energize the Maccabees for war. And that ends up in the New Testament, and then in the church fathers, it's critical because they understand this is part of how you have two natures of Christ that don't get confused, and yet they commune with each other, right? The one energizing the other. And it also became critical to their understanding of us and what is it that we're doing in Christianity? What is it that we hope for, participating in the nature of God? Now, the reason,
but there's a way, it's important to specify that the energies of God are God. They're not seen as a lower, even though there's a distinction, they're not seen as a lower form of divinity or as some kind of.
Right. And this is the critical point. This is where I was going with this, because there's a tendency to think in very binary terms, in a Western context of, there's the divine nature and then there's creatures. And what you get is a much more complex ontology when you're talking about the Eastern Church Fathers. Yeah, there's the divine nature, there's the 𝗃𝗁𝒂𝒂𝒂, the subjects that have it and give it stasis. And then there's also these divine energies that exude from it. And what's fascinating is these are called, by people like Maximus, the confessor, right? These are the works of God that precede creation. Well, if they precede creation, then they're not creatures. And then you have this strange language, like they're the things around God that are God, they're the processions, they're the energies. And so you get all of these sort of strange foreign language to us that's there in people like Pseudo-Dionysius and the Cappadocians. And yet, as you pointed out, everything about that ontology says these energies are God. And so just like on the one hand, you don't get to peer into my mind as it is, but you do encounter these things that exude from it, right? The energies, as I'm speaking right now, these are activities or operations in my mind, and they are part of me, right? And they are expressions of that mind. They are punctuated, finite, particular expressions of the nature of my mind. And so in the same way, the divine energies are that. And the reason that's critical is because if the energies themselves can be participated in by creatures, right? An image of God, or an image in general, an image is capable of participating in the attributes of that which it images, right? Its shape, its color, things like that. If we are images of God, and so can participate in God's attributes, which the Eastern Church Fathers refer to the energies, not to the divine nature, then what that means is those parts of God, which is one of the words Maximus the Confessor uses, right, can be resident in you and in me and in a relic and in an icon, right, and in nature,
and in some ways necessarily so, because it's that which makes it exist. Ultimately.
Right. Well, right. That does make it kind of important. But this is where that divide right there, even though it's a lot of metaphysics that I just went through, that divide is critical, so that even though you might find in the West this sort of hierarchy and this notion of participation and this memory of a certain theology that's essentially Christian, the very fact that grace is created in the Latin West, and it's primarily just an effect on the creature, as opposed to in the East, where it actually is God immanently present in the creature. It's part of God in the creature. That is such a critical distinction in terms of ontology that has, going back to something you mentioned before, remythologizing the world. I mean, this is a critical feature of, if you're going to talk about a mythologized world and talking about the sort of spiritual dimensions of nature, like I talked about with the nuns, right? Spiritual dimensions of you or me, and the spiritual potential of the cosmos itself. This is where that sort of thing that you find in the Eastern Fathers, I think, is so critical to seeing how different the worldview really is, even though it sounds very similar on many points.
And then I think in many ways it also comes, let's say, comes at a point where, let's say, the strong dualities of modernity are kind of breaking down, and we can see already the problem of this created grace problem, or the creature as outside God, is the problem of a kind of radical duality, even though it's maybe not formulated that way explicitly at the highest level. It ends up playing out that way, where you have, God above, and then all these things that are created out there, and there's an arbitrary relationship of will between God and the world. Whereas, this kind of way of mechanically describing also the phenomena in reality it's breaking down. It doesn't hold. Like, it doesn't even hold in terms of cognitive science and in terms of the quantum physics and these kind of limits of science that people are reaching. It doesn't hold. And you need, the notion of rather the inevitability of meaning is something that I talk about a lot, like the inevitability of identity and the inevitability of hierarchies of identity for the world to actually exist is becoming more and more apparent. And what, let's say, the ontology that St. Maximus proposes for us, it gives us a very powerful solution to avoid duality, to really have true non-duality. You know how people love non-duality. St. Maximus actually offers us a true non-duality, which is not a collapse into a monad, but rather this like you said, it's like this procession of energies, this procession of grace that comes down from God and brings everything back into God, doesn't deny the multiplicity of existence, but ultimately makes everything participate in this hierarchy of meaning, this hierarchy of purposes. Maybe purpose is a better word even than meaning. Like, it's all, everything that exists has a ultimate purpose, and that ultimate purpose is actually God, to the extent to which it can embedded into all these other things, like a symphony. Is the way you portrayed it as a symphony is a much better way to understand it. Like, it's all playing together, like to kind of become let's say the creation is becoming the lover of God, you could say, in a way that is fully unitive, like bringing it together into him as in a mysterious union, you could say.